Do you ever notice yourself withdrawing, devaluing, or feeling secretly hurt when someone doesn't meet your expectations? What if the behaviors that many people simply label as narcissistic, selfish, or manipulative are actually shaped by deeper, unconscious emotional feelings and patterns? Could understanding what is driving your reactions unlock the possibility for real change in relationships? Hello everyone, welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. In the prior episode, we explored the hidden dynamics of narcissistic relationships, how withdrawal, devaluation, and subtle or overt abusive behavior follows a script shaped by unconscious thoughts and feelings, and how these patterns protect a fragile sense of self. Now, in part 2, we'll continue that discussion and dive into what happens next. How recognizing these unconscious thoughts and feelings, understanding their impact, and exploring the underlying motivations can open the door to real change in both behavior and relationships. To set the stage, I want to revisit something from part 1 and unpack it even further, because this is where a lot of misunderstanding happens. On social media, in pop psychology, or sometimes even in casual conversations, we are quick to label these behaviors as selfish, controlling, manipulative, and then conclude that the person exhibiting them will never change. These labels are not wrong per se, but they are surface-level descriptors. They point out what's happening externally, not why it's happening internally. And when we stop at labels, it's no wonder people feel stuck, hopeless, or convinced that change is impossible. In part 1, by walking through an example, I demonstrated how unconscious thoughts and fantasies can distort reality during a moment of conflict. And I said something like this. So in these moments, if I were inquiring, for example, when your wife retired to the bedroom earlier, did you think about checking in with her? I suggested that if I asked that question, I might hear something like, and I quote, "Who gives a shit about what's happening with her? I'm not concerned about her problems. Why would I want to hear her complain when I have problems of my own?" What I want to highlight here is that on the surface, this response looks like selfishness and hostility, and it can be incredibly off-putting to hear someone think and talk about his wife in this way. But underneath the man's knee-jerk angry reaction to my question, we slowly began to see that he was reacting to something else. But what is that something else? What are you talking about? You might now be asking. As I just mentioned, you might ask here, wait, are you saying that he was just overreacting? Or that I'm just overreacting when I get angry like this? The key is that in this example, your wife retiring to the bedroom earlier, is her absence is subjectively devastating, and it triggers a deeply internalized pattern. Perhaps there have been many early experiences, moments when emotional needs were unmet, or when affection and attention were withheld or went missing. These moments are unconsciously replayed. This is why even minor perceived slights of everyday life, they can provoke disproportionate withdrawal or anger. From a psychodynamic perspective, these reactions are attempts to protect yourself against feelings of perhaps helplessness, vulnerability, or rejection that have roots in childhood. Maybe they have roots somewhere else. That's the main point. The point is that long before the current relationship existed, these feelings were already there. But here's the complicated part. Most people around you would never see these more vulnerable or painful feelings that I just mentioned, because in that moment, you may attack, withdraw, become passive-aggressive, or silently hold a grudge. The inner logic from what I hear from my own patients, it looks something like this. Not again. I'm not going to be made to feel frightened, alone, powerless, or worthless ever again. And this is the crucial point. Understanding these inner dialogues and motives is what separates surface level observations from real insight. Labeling someone as narcissistic, selfish, or controlling only scratches the surface. It identifies what's happening, but not why it's happening. To move toward meaningful change, we need to start asking, what is driving this behavior? And what thoughts or fears are you protecting yourself from in these moments? You might be beginning to hear this, but I just want to be very clear. This isn't just about changing surface behaviors, like withdrawal or devaluation. Wait a minute, hold up. You may now be thinking, so my wife or my husband or my parents, they're not just being selfish or mean? Or you may be asking, do you mean that I'm not just and I hear this sometimes, a selfish bastard? That's what they're called. These, and I quote, selfish behaviors, like not checking in with your wife when she retreats early to the bedroom, or withdrawing from the family when there's some kind of conflict with your son, are the tip of the iceberg. Beneath them often lies a set of internal thoughts and emotional strategies aimed at maintaining a sense of control, coherence, and self-worth. Psychodynamically, this is the intersection of defense mechanisms and unmet needs. The withdrawal, devaluation, or irritability are attempts to manage overwhelming feelings of perhaps, and I say perhaps because we don't know what they are, but perhaps inadequacy, fear, loneliness, feeling alone, or feeling ashamed. And I just said, and I quote, to manage them. But I think the real goal is to make them disappear before they become consciously unbearable. The real shift comes when we can uncover the unconscious thoughts, the, and I quote, unknown feelings driving these outward behaviors. The real change begins to take hold when we can see how reality and fantasy, that's what's going on inside that we're not actually privy to, but when reality and fantasy collide, and when we recognize how these patterns ripple out, affecting both the individual and the people around them. Only then can real change begin, instead of simply labeling and condemning, and I quote, the narcissist who will never change. When these inner and not yet conscious thoughts, as I keep emphasizing, and feelings are brought to light and taken into account, it becomes possible to explore the situation in a far more nuanced way. Stated differently, we can begin to understand the egregious behaviors. In this example we're following, his behavior is not just acting hostile, cruel, or manipulative and neglectful. Those behaviors are an enactment of a deeply entrenched fantasy system. In other words, they're an enactment. They make something come alive. The behavior makes something come alive that's already inside of him. In this light, his withdrawal, devaluation, or harsh way he treats his wife is not seen as just he's an idiot or he is a manipulative narcissist, but is also seen as an attempt to maintain an internal sense of omnipotence or control and avoid the unbearable, again, the unbearable what? You see, we don't know what that is. That's the whole point of him acting, or of you acting this way. But close exploration with these individuals typically reveals that the what is about shame, disappointment, or feelings of loss that arise when the fantasy of togetherness, what I called in part one, the perfect union, when that's threatened, when the perfect union of togetherness is threatened, we see these outbursts. Most importantly, If you yourself have been accused of manipulation or emotionally withdrawing, paying attention to what preceded your emotional outburst could potentially open the door to genuine development. I have found that when someone exhibiting these aggressive, narcissistic defenses begins to recognize the reality, I quote, the reality of their loved one's actions. Let me give an example of that. For example, understanding that when your loved one goes out with friends, this may simply mean that they want to connect with others. I know it doesn't feel that way, and this is hard to believe because you become so convinced that her socializing with friends is a statement about disloyalty. But if you begin to see an alternative reality, you can imagine that there is another way to interpret her socializing with friends. The sense of persecution then can lessen. In other words, if you can open your mind to alternative explanations, different realities that can exist simultaneously, then you feel less persecuted. Why? Because in your mind, she's not betraying or being disloyal, but she's socializing with friends because she wants other connections. Doesn't mean she doesn't want a connection with you. In other words, the sense of, and I quote, look at what she's doing to me, or, and I quote, she's leaving me, that begins to diminish. This new awareness then allows guilt over your ruthless actions to transform into regret, fostering remorse and a desire to make amends rather than fueling anger or the impulse for revenge. Can you imagine that? Remorse and regret over your behavior because you get so angry because, again, you're convinced that she's being disloyal or she's leaving you. But in any matter, can you imagine that? Remorse and regret instead of revenge because you've been wronged again. To illustrate this shift from hurt, rage, and revenge to guilt and remorse, imagine he notices that when she laughs at a joke with a friend, he initially feels excluded or dismissed. The automatic thought might be, she's ignoring me, or I'm not that funny, or I'm not that important, I'm not that significant. If I can help him come to see that attention and affection went missing, see, now we're getting to that unconscious stuff that I mentioned earlier, stuff that he doesn't necessarily see, but that attention and affection went missing. And rather than processing all of what that means to him, he immediately goes to rage, attack, and blame. So in other words, just to be clear, what I'm pointing out is when we can focus on the underlying feelings that something went missing, right? And not even focus on that, not even yet, but that what I'm showing him is that by his rage and attack, he doesn't allow himself to think about that maybe something went missing. See, that never gets processed. He treats this situation, and this is what I begin to help him see and recognize, in only one way. She intentionally did something to hurt me. By naming over and over and then recognizing this pattern, that the perceived exclusion is triggering old, unresolved emotional memories, he begins to slow down, pause, reflect, and choose a more adaptive response. What we see is he begins to become curious rather than withdraw or confront and attack. So let me just go over that again quickly because it may have been a little confusing or I may have said it in a confusing way. The first step is to begin to allow him to see or help him see that by focusing on what she intentionally did to him, like that's all the focus, he's missing focusing on something else. And what is he missing? Well, actually, he's not focusing on what went missing. And what went missing was frustrating and brings up other feelings that she's not available. But none of that gets dealt with because it's just the focus is always on the anger. Okay. And then the second piece is recognizing this pattern that he constantly goes to this thought about how he's being attacked or abandoned. I'll expand on this example in a moment. I'll say more about it if it's not yet clear. But first, I want to pause like he does. I want to pause too, and I want to emphasize something crucial. This kind of healing, the shift from defensive reactivity, the reactivity is right to the anger or withdrawing, to awareness and repair, can only unfold if the person exhibiting narcissistic traits is willing to truly face a complex, often uncomfortable situation. So that's the first order of business, is can they even face something rather than a rigid reality that they've constructed in their mind based on their own past experiences. It requires the ability to acknowledge and accept responsibility for what they've done without immediately retreating into denial, blame, or self-justification. It's not just about, and I quote, sitting with difficult feelings. It's about noticing the thoughts and fears driving those feelings and behaviors. It's about recognizing how these fears distort reality and learning to respond to a loved one in a way that reflects the actual situation. Remember, she's just going out with friends because she wants social connections, or she just retired to her room because maybe she had a rough day at work, so she retired to the room early that evening. See, so that's the shift, is reflecting on the actual situation rather than the internal threat, which is something that still needs to come to light, which I said is the unknown. We don't know what that is. This means confronting the urge to rewrite events. So again, for things to go accordingly, for healing to take place, that's what I'm detailing here. It also means confronting the urge to rewrite events. It means confronting the urge to devalue the other person or to assert control, and instead practicing the capacity to perceive and tolerate the partner's separate or different perspective on something, even when it triggers deep discomfort or shame within you. See, so you get the sense a couple of things are happening simultaneously, and this is not easy if one just stays stuck in their own interpretation or reality, their own reality of what just occurred. But now you may be thinking, isn't it really hard or almost impossible to tolerate that discomfort, right? Because what I'm pointing out is a lot of ambiguity here, is that to not know something, don't have a foregone conclusion.
Let's take a quick break.
Are you tired of feeling like you're walking on eggshells all the time? Do you feel drained, confused, or like nothing you do is ever good enough? Are you stuck in a cycle of elation, then criticism and confusion? If any of this sounds familiar, you're not alone. And that's exactly why I created Office Hours with Dr. Anthony Mazzella. That's me. Office Hours is a low-cost, small group space where you could bring your questions about narcissistic traits and dynamics and the places where you feel stuck. You'll be met with honest, grounded feedback. I'll hold the group with structure, but there's also space for real conversation. This is a space designed for anyone looking for clarity, insight, and support. If that sounds like you, just click the link in the show notes to join us. Okay, I hope to see you there. Psychodynamically, tolerating difference and discomfort isn't simply enduring. It's actively recognizing that your internal narrative about loss, threat, or rejection is not the current reality. Yes, of course, there's a grain of truth to this reality. Your wife really did laugh at somebody else's joke or retired to the bedroom early. I'm not dismissing that. But that which is driving the intensity of your reaction has one foot in the present and also one foot in the past. In other words, it's not just about the behavior or your wife going to the bedroom early. Figuring out that piece, the 1 foot in the past, is just another part of the process. But initially, making that distinction is crucial. It allows the individual to respond based on the current situation rather than unresolved past wounds, creating space for connection rather than escalation. Recognizing the underlying dynamics, one example I mentioned in part 1, was what Freud called, and I quote, "Your Majesty the baby." So an underlying dynamic has to do with what? And by the way, later theorists, I mentioned this earlier, called this the shared unconscious fantasy. Understanding this underlying need for perfect attunement and how it collides with reality is a crucial first step in checking your own reactions when someone is not immediately attentive to you. For those exhibiting these narcissistic reactions and defenses, it's also the first step in beginning to loosen the grip of these deeply ingrained, destructive convictions and patterns. To return to the prototypical example mentioned earlier, when things are going well, he's starting to sort out inner versus external reality. His wife tells him that she's invited her parents to stay for the week. As I hear him begin to get worked up about the invitation, I can help him notice how he is anticipating competition. That's what he says. I hear it in his associations, that he anticipates competition for her attention and immediately interprets it as a threat to their bond. With assistance, he begins to recognize what he calls, and I quote, low tolerance for separation from his wife. I suggest that he avoids thinking more deeply about what this separation means to him by focusing instead on his frustration, irritability, and his desire to control his wife and lash out at her and lash out at his in-laws, right? So you see what I'm doing there? That's what I was trying to get at earlier, is I'm showing him and I'm suggesting that he's focusing on frustration rather than the separation and all of what that means to him. By identifying these internal processes, he can start to see how his automatic responses are shaped by the perceived threat to his internal sense of security rather than the reality of the situation. At this point, now I can imagine that you may be asking, does that mean I'm not really angry about the present? Just old wounds? To that question about what gets you angry and reactive, I would say it's a little more complicated. The anger or frustration is real in the present moment, but its intensity and focus are amplified by unresolved emotional wounds, if that makes sense. Psychodynamically, this is the interplay between current relational triggers and unconscious templates formed in early attachment experiences. Awareness of this interplay allows for a step back, noticing the automatic response, reflecting on its origin, and choosing a behavior that aligns with the reality rather than what's going on inside of you. In this composite example, as he begins to notice these automatic reactions, the way even small differences, disagreements, and separations trigger discomfort, he becomes aware of what he calls, and again I quote, a low tolerance for separation. But the key step is not just noticing the reaction itself, but recognizing what it reveals about his internal world. His growing awareness that he struggles with accepting difference signals the emergence of a self-reflective capacity, a willingness to observe internal patterns without immediately acting on them. We can even say his frustration tolerance is increasing, something with Your Majesty the baby never develops. You see, if you come from an overly gratifying environment, which many people who have these narcissistic traits do, where limitations were not set, right? Frustration tolerance doesn't really develop in the way it should. So in any matter, the main point that I'm trying to make here with this fellow in this prototypical example is, this is where real change begins. It's the moment when the individual can pause, reflect, and consider alternative interpretations of the situation and therefore alternative responses. He's no longer defaulting to withdrawal, devaluation, or attempts to control. And this is how someone exhibiting narcissistic characteristics begins to shift. And yes, truly change, right? Change can happen. in addition to experiencing guilt and remorse instead of revenge, developing awareness of the tension between wanting to dominate or control and wanting to respect someone else's autonomy becomes a central part of the healing process. So, let's go way back to where we started in part 1. We asked whether your partner's hostility means they actually enjoy your pain, whether the humiliation is part of some twisted game, or whether devaluing you brings them gratification. Or, if you've been questioning yourself, whether those moments when you lash out, withdraw, or dismiss someone you love are signs of something darker inside of you. That was another question, right? Are these all signs that something deeper and darker is going on inside of you if you behave this way? What I hope we've seen together is that these behaviors are sometimes, but rarely, about pleasure in someone else's suffering. And I quote sometimes. More often, these behaviors are defenses against wounds too raw to face directly. The cruelty, the withdrawal, the control, the manipulation, they protect against feelings, in the prototypical example I gave, of worthlessness, shame, or loss. That was the biggest one, loss and separation and feeling alone. So, maybe the deeper question isn't simply, do they enjoy my pain? But rather, what pain of their own are they hiding from? Or, when I act in these ways, what pain of mine am I avoiding? I don't pretend to have all the answers. These are really tough and complicated questions. But my hope is that this conversation gave you a more comprehensive understanding of what, on the surface, can look like simple labels: narcissistic, controlling, manipulative, cruel, but underneath are human defenses, full of contradictions. And if we approach these contradictions in ourselves and others with a bit more curiosity and humility, real change is possible. If this spoke to you and you're curious to learn more about all issues related to narcissism, please support the show by subscribing so you don't miss what's coming next. And even more importantly, take a moment to leave a review. Reviews make the podcast easier for others to find, which helps the show grow. The more the show grows, the more I can invest in creating thoughtful content that supports you in understanding and navigating your experiences with narcissism. Okay, thanks for being here with me. I'm grateful we got to explore this one together. Until next time, take care of yourself. Bye for now. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.